Every one of these deaths is an unspeakable tragedy for the loved ones of those killed, a nightmare horror beyond imagining, and it would be beyond disgusting for anyone like me or the president to try to use this horror to score cheap political points. That is not what this video is about. However, you see, and as you're about to see, this was murder. If the evidence wasn't powerful, if it wasn't overwhelming, we wouldn't be here. But since it is powerful and overwhelming, how can we not seek justice for the victims? Everyone who has seen this video is shocked at the way the Black Hawk helicopter just plows straight into the oncoming passenger jet with no visible attempt to change course.
It appears from the angle there, hard to say for sure, but it looks as if the Black Hawk helicopter was not taking evasive action at that moment.
But what you did have is you had vision. The helicopter had vision of the plane. For some reason, it just kept going.
These were two very experienced pilots aboard the Black Hawk. The path they were flying had them facing in the direction of the jetliner for the last 2 minutes of the flight. At that time, they told the tower that they had the jet in view.
At 8:46:08, the Black Hawk crew responded. They had the traffic in sight and requested visuals.
Having had the passenger jet in view for nearly 2 minutes, they took no evasive action, ever? How is that possible? Observing that there was no evasive action and asking how did this happen is absolutely central, and led establishment observers to ask some disturbing questions.
Acknowledge that. Is it possible there was some sort of mechanical failure which made it impossible for them to control the craft?
The facts about the helicopter's flight known at the time did not help explain what happened. You see, this is the flight path of the helicopter. It's called a corridor because these helicopters routinely fly this precise route. The protocols for this flight path are very carefully and clearly laid out, and there have been no accidents in the over 20 years that such flights have taken place. It is an ironclad rule that helicopters flying this route must descend to below 200 feet at this point. We also need to mention that these were two very experienced pilots performing what's called a check ride. Captain Lobach, with 320 hours flying experience in this model of Black Hawk, was simply renewing her license to fly this helicopter. The check ride, as this license renewal test is called, was being administered by Chief Warrant Officer Andrew Eves, who in fact had slightly less flying time in this aircraft. Captain Lobach, then, was taking a license renewal test, being administered by a slightly lower rank with slightly less experience. But you know, given that this was a test, both would have been adhering to all the smallest details of correct procedure. And yet, somehow, as we will see, the helicopter was at 325 feet when it collided with the jet. The point is,
They shouldn't have been at the same height. It just kept going.
in other words, the helicopter pilots made a murderous error in flying too high and failing to maneuver out of the way. But the air traffic controllers also made a huge error, at least as bad, in failing to alert everyone about the helicopter being 125 feet above the 200-foot ceiling.
But it was exactly at the same height, and somebody should have been able to point that out.
Air traffic control should have commanded the Black Hawk to stop immediately and to descend 125 feet at all of these points along the route, every one. And the air traffic controller should have commanded the passenger jet to abort the landing and to ascend 100 feet immediately at all these points when the Black Hawk did not descend. And, again, the controller should have begun issuing all these commands beginning at this point, where the Black Hawk was first supposed to have already descended to 200 feet, 150 seconds before the collision. How did this not happen? These are the two central questions.
We are going to get to the bottom of this investigation.
We're all trying to get to the bottom of this.
No excuses. We're going to get to the bottom of this.
We'll get to the bottom of it.
You can't get to the bottom of this without answering these questions. Right, guys? So let's get started. On February 1st, 3.5 days after the crash, these two gentlemen, Todd Inman, the leader of the team, and his lead investigator, Bryce Banning, held a press conference. I've had a good deal of direct experience with the NTSB, and I have found them to be a great group of people, passionately committed to safety, to detail, to accuracy, and to honesty, as you're about to see. The FDR is the Flight Data Recorder. It is the data part of the black box.
The FDR contains about 400 parameters.
400 different parameters, 400 separate measures of every imaginable aspect of what's going on with an aircraft throughout the flight. Altitude, engine speed, rotor speed, air speed, GPS location, pitch, roll, and so on. It records what all the different instruments say about engine temperature, oil pressure, fuel level, whatever, as well as what all the equipment used to steer the aircraft are doing. Levers, throttles, flaps, elevators, all the equipment used to control speed, direction, and altitude.
The team that is working on this crash at DCA collectively has over 350 years of seniority with the NTSB.
This is 350 years of hands-on experience in air collisions. And let's note quickly that these people know what pilot error looks like. They know that the record of the instruments will show panicked attempts to make corrections in the final seconds. They know that the cockpit voice recorder typically will reveal brief, gut-wrenching, panicked hollering and screaming in the final seconds. Collectively, the team investigating this crash would have encountered such horrors of the last seconds of fatal crashes many hundreds of times. The black box from the CRJ, the passenger jet, was recovered the day before, and this is Bryce Banning giving his report on the final seconds of the CRJ.
At 8:47:58,
2 seconds before impact.
the crew had a verbal reaction.
Gut-wrenching, panicked hollering. This is going to be key later on, so make a note.
And FDR data showed the airplane beginning to increase its pitch.
That is, and we would expect, the crew of the passenger jet was making last-second panicked attempts to avoid collision by trying to ascend as rapidly as possible.
Sounds of impact were audible about 1 second later, followed by the end of the recording.
Are you ready? Because we are about to get deep into it.
When we received the recorders from the CRJ,
He means when they received the black box, the flight data and cockpit voice recorders from the passenger jet, the CRJ.
when we received the recorders from the CRJ, we were able to define an altitude of where it was very close to the time of impact. That is a data point we feel very comfortable with. Currently, the CRJ, based upon the data recorder, at the time of impact, was at 325 feet.
This is a hugely important point, a very big deal. The first of many screaming red flags for all sorts of reasons. First, as we just learned, the NTSB team investigating this crash have over 350 years of expertise. This number, 325 feet at the time of impact, is going to turn out to be very controversial. But these NTSB people we are looking at this press conference are the most experienced source of information available anywhere. And they have the black box flight data recorder. This is the very best information available. I've never seen information from a flight data recorder questioned. And this figure, 325 feet at the time of impact, also...
It is based on the ADSB data and the flight data recorder.
ADSB data is part of the specialized automated air collision avoidance system that is installed on all commercial and military aircraft. And this ADSB data comes directly from the aircraft's own instruments, and it is transmitted by each and every individual aircraft to the tower and to any other aircraft in the area in real time, so they can all try to avoid collisions. ADSB data and the data from the black box flight data recorder are considered the gold standard of reliability.
The CRJ, based upon the data recorder, at the time of impact, was at 325 feet. When we received the recorders from the CRJ, we were able to define an altitude of where it was very close to the time of impact. That is a data point we feel very comfortable with.
So these completely reliable people, who are completely expert and completely well-informed and in possession of all the best data, these people want us to know that they feel comfortable in telling us that 325 feet is the altitude the plane was at.
Obviously, an impact occurred, and I would say when an impact occurs, that is typically where the altitude of both aircraft were at the moment.
Right? If we know the altitude of the CRJ, we
obviously
know the altitude of the Black Hawk. And as you can see, this was a very, very direct hit, not a glancing blow. The entire front third of the Black Hawk was completely crushed and caved in. So we are very certain that the CRJ was at 325 feet, and we are just as certain that the Black Hawk was at the same altitude, 325 feet, 125 feet higher than the 200-foot maximum allowed. How did the Black Hawk pilots not notice that they were so far above their permitted altitude? How did the air traffic controller not notice that the Black Hawk pilots were so far above their permitted altitude? This is a screaming red flag, because the forces of evil are now trying to erase this completely expert and positively best-informed data announcement, and, as we will see, replace it with another obviously false number in an effort to confuse us all and to make sure that we don't
Get to the bottom.
Get to the bottom.
Get to the bottom.
Get to the bottom.
get to the bottom of the crime that occurred. How did all the automated collision avoidance systems in the tower, on the CRJ, and on the Black Hawk not notice that the Black Hawk was 125 feet too high and headed for catastrophe? These are all hella good questions and screaming red flags, but we're going to start with a close look at the performance of air traffic control.
But it was exactly at the same height, and somebody should have been able to point that out. These are not people that should be doing this particular job. They'd be very good for certain jobs, but not people that should be doing this particular job.
The somebodies he is referring to are, of course, the air traffic controllers. But imagine what these individuals must be going through, hearing the effing president take time out to blame them. They were already feeling the guilt that they were to blame for the deaths of 67 innocent people, mothers, fathers, children, husbands, and wives. And of course, interviewing the controllers was a central first priority of the NTSB investigation.
So now let's go on to controllers. We're getting full cooperation and access to those individuals we need. At this time, we have interviewed the local controller, the ground controller, and the local assist controller. These interviews take a long time, not because there's that much talking, but there's several breaks that occur for emotions, just to be able to compose themselves to talk about what happened. This is a controller's worst nightmare. It hits everyone that works in that cab and knows them very hard.
Now, it's touching and revealing, I think, that this NTSB board member and team leader, Todd Inman, is so obviously moved on behalf of the controllers that he shows so much understanding and sympathy for what they're going through that he took his time and he gave them time to tell their story. That's crucial to keep in mind as we look at this next bombshell.
Our preliminary review of what the tower cab was showing on the data screen that would have been in front of the controllers was 200 feet near the time of the accident.
Did you get that? The reporters in the room made him repeat it 6 times. So, once more?
Our preliminary review of what was showing on the data screen that would have been in front of the controllers was 200 feet near the time of the accident.
The obvious conclusion, no, is that the controllers didn't notice that the Black Hawk was 125 feet too high, and they didn't then order the Black Hawk to stop in its tracks and to descend long before it neared the flight path of the jet, because the controller's screen showed the Black Hawk was at a safe 200 feet. The controller didn't tell the jet to abort its landing and go safely up as drastically as it could for the same reason. The controllers thought the Black Hawk was safely below 200 feet, 125 feet below the flight path of the jet. And we're just getting started describing the implications of this bombshell. For example, where the hell did this murderously false information come from? This information had to have come from the helicopter's own instruments. There is no other possible source. As we saw a minute ago, every aircraft has ADS-B, which broadcasts the aircraft's altitude, position, speed, and ID continuously to the tower and to any aircraft in the vicinity. This data is then used by the automated air collision avoidance system, when necessary, to generate audible crash warning alerts for the pilots and controllers. There are 2 points I want to make. First, the readout on the tower screen viewed by the controller had to have come from the Black Hawk's own instruments, unless it came from some diabolical unknown source broadcasting false data with the intention of murdering 67 people. But setting that aside, we now have a very solid clue, at least the beginnings of an answer to this question. It seems more than likely that the instruments on the Black Hawk were also telling those pilots that they were safely below the 200-foot maximum altitude. This doesn't even slightly address the question of why the Black Hawk did not take evasive action, but that question surely needs to be addressed. We are deeply indebted to this guy for everything we just learned in the last 5 minutes, and make no mistake, he knew he was in for trouble by sharing this explosive fact.
But I want to be very clear. Our team has had some internal debate on releasing one part of this.
There was dissension within his own ranks. People telling him, "Don't say it, this is trouble."
You don't realize who you're messing with.
But he wouldn't shut up.
And whenever I explain it, I hope you will understand why.
I hope so too. No doubt he largely did it for the controllers, who were facing such an inappropriate and malicious attack from Trump.
But it was exactly at the same height, and somebody should have been able to point that out. These are not people that should be doing this particular job. They'd be very good for certain jobs, but not people that should be doing this particular job.
No doubt Inman felt that if this baboon could make such a malicious, completely unprofessional, completely ignorant attack on the controllers, well then he, Inman, could defend them with facts that showed that they were innocent. No doubt the controllers had been telling him for 3 days that the scope said 200 feet, and partly he spoke up because as a leader of the NTSB, he sees telling the truth as his mission in life.
We're the gold standard across the world because we tell the facts. That's what we're trying to do.
As we are about to see, There's much more that he might have said. But they had only just recovered the black boxes from the Black Hawk hours before, and the recorders hadn't been analyzed at all, so he promised the reporters that he would be back tomorrow.
Our preliminary review of what was showing on the data screen that would have been in front of the controllers was 200 feet near the time of the accident. Again, this data is preliminary. Tomorrow, we feel very comfortable that we'll be getting the additional data sources that will confirm precisely what it would have been on the screen at the time. We will have the exact data set tomorrow evening.
The thing is, for Inman, tomorrow never came. He had 2 press conferences scheduled for the next day and the day after that, and both press conferences were suddenly canceled without any explanation. He was rudely yanked from working on this crash and sent to muck around in the swamps of Mississippi. In fact, for the entire NTSB, tomorrow's press conference never came, nor one for the day after, or the day after that, nor the day after that, or the day after that. Although we learned on February 1st that
the combination CVR and the flight data recorder was extracted last night from the aircraft.
From the Black Hawk, the NTSB inexplicably held no press conferences at all for 2 solid weeks. Can you tell that we're getting into some very dangerous territory here? Seriously, as I watch all these details unfold, revealing the crime hidden inside, my guts are twisting like I'm watching a particularly gruesome episode of Law and Order. This is Hela, a mythological goddess of death. She's not really in this story that I know of. I mean, maybe? But this is mythological Hela's lying cousin, Hela Liar, and the chair of the NTSB. And when this real live Hela Liar finally showed up 2 weeks late, she showed why she gets to wear the horns on her head and evil on her chest, and especially why they call her Hela Liar. We are about to go deep into the issue of the missing collision warnings, the cockpit and tower alarms that are supposed to help all air traffic keep out of each other's way. So please forgive a quick review. The ADSB system transmits an aircraft's information out to all parties concerned, tower and aircraft. And the air collision avoidance system takes that information and, when necessary, not only warns all parties, it also gives each aircraft appropriate commands. No such warnings were given. This is huge. But what is huger and criminal is that Hela Liar, for some reason, is trying to cover it up. In order to distract us from the fact that there were no warnings from the collision avoidance system, she goes into this great detail about what the system is and how it works, without mentioning in any fashion, not even a hint, that the system inexplicably, completely failed. Just to confuse us, I think, she calls it
TCAS.
I think she just made that up, but no matter.
TCAS resolution advisories, or RAs, unlike traffic advisories, or TAs, are recommended escape maneuvers, for example, climb or descend, level off. Keep in mind that a TA is issued when the intruding aircraft is about 20 seconds from the closest point of approach or 0.3 nautical miles, whichever occurs first. They are advisory. RAs indicate a collision threat and require immediate action.
Did she do that right? Are you properly confused? If she was actually trying to explain the truth to us, she should have explained that if 2 aircraft are on courses that will bring them within 1/3 of a mile of each other, the system is supposed to issue a traffic alert, or TA, which will be audible on both aircraft 20 seconds before they get that close when they are here. Traffic alerts are not a huge deal. A TA or traffic alert is just a heads up to the pilots. It tells them there's traffic, Don't be surprised when you see that plane or helicopter. We all know it's out there. Just don't try to hit it and you'll be fine. The second kind of alert is much more serious, and it is called an RA, or Resolution Advisory. An RA is a huge deal. An RA tells the pilot, you are going to die if you don't take the following actions immediately, and then it tells the pilot exactly what to do to avoid death. Obviously, if you're the pilot, you want to get this information as early as possible, hopefully the day before, but 20 seconds would be nice. Now let's just note, this is a computerized system. It relies on the data that it receives automatically from the ADSB system on both aircraft, telling it the altitude, direction, and speed of all the aircraft in the vicinity. At this moment, in the final seconds of the flight, the ADSB signals from both aircraft should have produced a screaming resolution advisory, telling the CRJ to ascend and telling the Black Hawk to stop immediately and to descend. So did the pilots get this warning and they simply ignored it before plunging to their deaths? This is Bryce Banning, who we met before. A few hours before speaking at this press conference, he had listened to the voice recording from the CRJ passenger jet. He's speaking on February 1st, 2 weeks before Hela, and at the same press conference as Todd Inman, and he's going to read to us from the transcript of the CRJ Cockpit voice recorder. He's reading the final 21 seconds.
At 8:47:39, a radio transmission from the tower was audible asking Pat 25 if the CRJ was in sight. 1 second later, the crew received an automated traffic advisory stating traffic.
That is, there was heard on the CRJ cockpit voice recorder a non-emergency traffic advisory, not a resolution advisory collision warning, just an alert to be aware of traffic out there, 19 seconds before impact.
At 8:47:58, the crew had a verbal reaction.
Horribly, naturally, and of course, the CRJ crew saw the Black Hawk coming at them and reacted verbally as any human being would, realizing that they are about to die. I don't like seeing this. I don't like showing it to you, and I would have left this out if it wasn't crucial. But as you'll see in a couple of minutes, this verbal reaction is a critical issue.
And FDR data showed the airplane beginning to increase its pitch.
This tells us that in the last second, the CRJ crew tried desperately to evade the crash by ascending.
Sounds of impact were audible about 1 second later, followed by the end of the recording.
So that's it, all of it. We just heard about all of the warnings that were recorded by the CRJ cockpit voice recorder. There was an automated traffic advisory alerting the CRJ pilots that there was
traffic.
And there was no resolution advisory warning telling the CRJ, you're all going to die if you don't ascend. No warning, none ever. This shows a complete, total failure of the collision avoidance system. A complete failure of the most important safety feature in aviation today.
Resolution advisories, or RAs, unlike traffic advisories, or TAs, are recommended escape maneuvers, for example, climb or descend, level off.
We're going to look more closely at how Hela Liar gave us this detailed description of what the system is and how it's supposed to work without telling us or even hinting that this most critical of all safety features completely failed, causing this horrific event, the worst airline disaster in 20 years. And we're just getting started with the malfeasance of Hela Liar and her dark overlords. I mean, this horror show makes Law and Order look wholesome. At least there's no demons in Law and Order. And Law and Order is fiction. You can let it go psychologically, emotionally. When it's over, you can forget about it because it's not real. But good grief, welcome to hell where we effing live. This is madness, but
Look, I'm not crazy. I'm not paranoid. I'm experienced. Check the
NTS website yourself.
You'll see.
I don't want you to take my word for this. Google NTSB Media Briefing 4 and watch this press conference yourself. The relevant portion starts 10 minutes in and is no more than 5 minutes long. Right now, we're going to look at exactly what Helaliar has to say about all the warnings generated by the air collision avoidance system at this press conference, where she's supposed to be summarizing all the information from all the black boxes and from the tapes of the air traffic controller's transmissions. And this is the question we're trying to answer.
At 8:47:40, the CRJ crew received an automated traffic advisory stating traffic, traffic.
We already knew that, right? We just saw how Bryce Banning read this same information 2 weeks before Hella from the transcript of the CRJ voice recorder. And this is it.
The CRJ crew received an automated traffic advisory stating traffic, traffic.
Hella's description also included no collision warnings. The CRJ got a traffic alert, no warning. And everyone agrees that the Blackhawk got zip. How can that be, Hella? How is that not worth mentioning, Hella? The failure of these most critical safety systems should be, for the NTSB, and for the NTSB chair especially, the primary dominant concern, arguably her only concern. And instead, she does her best to cover it up, to distract us from the fact that this failure even happened. I want to note that we can ask these questions now, but we've got a lot more evidence to look at before we start trying to answer the how and the why. It's hard to decide which of Helaliar's critical other lies, distortions, and omissions is the most grievous. We've started with Hella's failure to even mention the complete absence of crash warnings, because that is her most basic job and her most basic failure. So what's next? You could argue that this next point is the most startling, blood-chilling, and screaming red flag, telling us that this is not an accident investigation at all, but a criminal investigation. No, O.J. did not kill the people on the CRJ. O.J.'s case gives insight into a particular type of screaming red flag, and I apologize that O.J.'s case is the best example that I can think of. In the first hour after Nicole Brown Simpson's murder, Detective Ronald Phillips called O.J. to tell him that his ex-wife had been murdered, and the detective was shocked by what he didn't hear. O.J. did not ask any questions about Nicole's murder. Not how, not when, not who, not where, not anything. The point, for us, is that homicide detectives, like NTSB investigators, have certain routines that they inevitably follow. For example, they have to contact the victim's family members to deliver the news and to answer questions, inevitably hundreds of times in a career. They are very familiar, all too familiar, with how people react. The survivors always want to know how, when, where, and especially who. And they want to know so badly, they're liable to get mad if, for example, the detectives don't know if it was an accident, a murder, or a suicide. O.J.'s failure, then, to ask even one of these questions was a screaming red flag to the detectives.
At 8:47:58, the crew had a verbal reaction.
Similarly, the NTSB investigators, over the course of a career, have to listen to hundreds of these cockpit voice recorder tapes of the final seconds in the lives of the human beings in the cockpits of hundreds of planes as they perish. And so, like the murder investigators, the NTSB investigators know what the last seconds of these tapes sound like, that they will be filled with brief, gut-wrenching, panicked, hollering and screaming. For the privacy of all crash victims, they have a strict policy never to make this part of the cockpit recordings public. They have even developed a discreet, polite, and intentionally bland term to describe this moment of genuine human horror.
The crew had a verbal reaction.
Verbal reaction is the non-graphic, polite, neutral term that they use to describe the screaming that goes on as pilots face their imminent death. Now, watch this.
Is there anything in the voice recorder indicating that the crew of the Blackhawk saw the impending collision?
Is there anything in the voice recorder that the crew of the Blackhawk could see or tell that there was an impending collision? We do not have any indication that the Blackhawk crew would have seen that.
Just to be clear, the reporter is asking whether the Blackhawk crew had a verbal reaction to seeing the oncoming jet in their last seconds of life.
We do not have any indication that the Blackhawk crew would have seen that.
So, this hella liar, this despicable denier of the most glaring and critical truths, says that on the cockpit voice recorder, there is no
indication that the Blackhawk crew would have seen an impending collision.
In other words, in NTSB parlance, the Blackhawk crew inexplicably and contrary to any expectation had no
verbal reaction.
We would have to be nuts to believe this story, not coming from her. And
I'm not crazy.
The tower somehow had deadly false information on their scopes that she has never mentioned. The collision warnings somehow failed to work, and she has inexplicably and criminally never mentioned it. And now, this horned snake is telling us that the cockpit voice recorder somehow failed to record any verbal reaction by the crew. Oh, because there wasn't one, don't you know? But the fact that Hella is such a truth-hating snake is not the most disturbing part of this whole picture. You see, I don't suspect that Hella put that false altitude on the tower scope, or that she somehow disabled the collision warning system, or that she somehow tampered with the Blackhawk voice recorder, erasing the shouting and screaming that certainly occurred. This absence of a verbal reaction invites us to speculate that the cockpit voice recorder of the Blackhawk helicopter has been tampered with. Just one more important piece of evidence suggesting that we not only have to question the validity of everything that these people are telling us, we also have to begin to recognize that this press conference is a crime scene, and that these people are truly insane criminals guilty of indiscriminate mass murder that is overtly being covered up by the chair of the NTSB and the military and the president and the vice president. And don't relax, we're barely getting started.
It looks as if the Blackhawk helicopter was not taking evasive action at that moment.
Let's make the point that, except in the case of suicide, all aircraft, without exception, make panicked, sudden, drastic last-second maneuvers the instant they realize that they're about to collide with another aircraft. and the CRJ made such drastic last-second corrections.
At 8:47:58, or 1 second before impact, the CRJ began to increase its pitch, reaching about 9 degrees nose up at the time of collision. FDR data show the CRJ elevators were deflected near their maximum nose up travel, and roll was 11 degrees left wing down.
What she needs to be telling us is that the CRJ, as it approached the runway, would normally have been at -3 degrees of pitch. That is, pointing nose down, -3 degrees. This is the standard pitch for landing. So then,
the CRJ began to increase its pitch, reaching about 9 degrees nose up at the time of collision.
in the last seconds, there was a total of 12 degrees of change in the pitch of the aircraft, from -3 degrees to +9, very substantial, as the CRJ crew tried desperately to avoid the collision by ascending. In order to accomplish this change in pitch, the CRJ crew made sure that
the CRJ elevators were deflected near their maximum nose-up travel.
That is, they moved the elevators from the nose-down position shown here to the maximum nose-up position shown here in order to lift the nose and the aircraft up as quickly as possible in order to avoid the collision.
And roll was 11 degrees left wing down.
Meaning that, in order to initiate a turn to its left, the CRJ dropped its left wing 11 degrees, also substantial, in order to turn away from the Black Hawk, which was on its right. NTSB investigators are very used to finding on the black box flight data recorder instrument data showing the panicked attempts by the crew to make corrections in the final seconds, which, as we just saw, is exactly what they found on the CRJ flight data recorder. But when we look at the black box data from the Black Hawk, we have yet another in an ever-growing parade of screaming red flags. The last leg of the Black Hawk's journey took it 3 miles from the Memorial Bridge to the collision in 2.5 minutes. At the time of the collision, the CRJ was traveling at 143 miles per hour, 200 feet per second. The entire length of the plane would pass by in front of the Black Hawk in less than a second. But to score this sort of a direct hit, the Black Hawk had to impact in front of the wings, giving them a margin of error of much less than half a second. They had to travel 3 miles and arrive at the exact spot with less than half a second margin of error. If they arrived 1 second too soon, they would pass by harmlessly in front of the CRJ. And if they arrived 1 second too late, the CRJ would pass by unharmed. In addition, the CRJ had started to ascend to try to evade the Black Hawk. As we also saw, they initiated a sharp turn to the left to try to evade the Black Hawk. Whoever navigated that Black Hawk scored an impressive navigational achievement in performing a very difficult and very precise operation perfectly.
The Black Hawk pitch at the time of the collision was about a ½ degree nose up with a left roll of 1.6 degrees and had been steady for the previous 5 seconds.
Nose up means that the Black Hawk was ascending into the path of the oncoming CRJ, and while the CRJ was turning to the left to avoid the Black Hawk,
with a left roll of 1.6 degrees,
was leaning left, turning into the oncoming CRJ. They held this collision course steady
for the previous 5 seconds.
What the hell? Were the Black Hawk pilots possessed by demons? Obviously they were. But so was the NTSB.
The last radio altitude recorded for the CRJ was 313 feet. Now we're confident with the radio altitude of the Black Hawk at the time of the collision that was 278 feet.
Got that? Hella says that the CRJ was at 313 feet, while the Black Hawk was at 278. Using her lying numbers, the CRJ was 35 feet higher than the Black Hawk. Subtracting the 10-foot height of the Black Hawk, they missed each other by 25 feet. What the hell? How could she say something so dumb? Since you asked me, first, because the demons who ordered her to say it are idiots. And second, because these idiots are also cowards. They sent out this counterfeit deadly spoof signal that told the tower and the CRJ that the Black Hawk was safely below 200 feet. But since they are not only idiots, but cowards as well, they are terrified that information about this counterfeit signal would inevitably, as we see that it has, lead back to them. So they ordered Hella Liar to go out there and take the heat for them, to humiliate and embarrass herself to protect them. So Hella had to pretend that Todd Inman never said it, or that he ever even existed. And they made her tell this stupid lie, and now they'll all pretend like the 200-foot readout on the tower scope was essentially correct, 278 feet is like 200 feet, plus 78 feet. It has 200 in it. You can't say 278 without saying 200. Oh yeah, so they are stupid is the correct answer. All this stuff makes them look so guilty. Firing Inman, pretending he was never there, never said anything, especially about a tower scope readout, and canceling all press conferences for 2 weeks, for the 2 weeks right after the black boxes were recovered, and telling these screaming red flag lies about the altitude of the aircraft, pretending there was no failure of the collision avoidance systems, and pretending all these screaming red flags are normal, no evasive action, no verbal response to impending death. It all just makes her look so evil. So why is she doing it? Oh yeah, I think it's because the demons giving her her orders are a bunch of really stupid cowards. Do you agree yet? Let's see if this next point convinces you. Hold on to your hats, because it's a hard wind coming up.
It looks as if the Black Hawk helicopter was not taking evasive action. And that leads investigators to the cockpit voice recorder to see what the crew was doing.
We will have the exact data set tomorrow evening. Tomorrow, we feel very comfortable that we'll be getting the additional data sources that will confirm precisely what it would have been on the screen at the time.
Just a quick review on this issue. Inman promised us on February 1st, 3 days after the crash, that he'd be back the next day with all the data from the Black Hawk black boxes.
And that leads investigators to the cockpit voice recorder.
And all those paying attention were very much focused on what the black boxes would reveal. But Inman was disappeared. His 2 scheduled press conferences were canceled, and we heard nothing from anyone at the NTSB for 14 days.
Barometric altitude. This is typically the altitude the pilots would use while they are flying. This was not recorded on the FDR.
This not recorded Black Hawk altitude data is a monstrous-sized red flag. It is arguably the main thing we were looking for, but it was
not recorded on the FDR.
Its absence could not possibly be more suspicious or inexplicable, and yet this doofus says it like it's nothing. He makes no comment about what a colossal failure it is. He makes no effort to explain how it could possibly have happened, and, most criminally, he pretends like there is no possible reason that anyone would ask this question.
Is barometric pressure setting. This is critical. This was not recorded by the FDR.
This is critical, eh? That's why you're so electrified, exasperated, and emotionally distraught to find it missing. Can barely maintain your composure. No, not you, Hegseth. Yes, I see you're excited. I mean our NTSB doofus over here. None of this, no matter how outrageous, bothers him. But you ain't seen nothing yet.
The next term is pressure altitude. We have found that this parameter is not valid. This is bad data.
Damn. So far, we have 3 types of altitude data. 2 of them are missing, and a third is bad data. All of these are huge red flags. Under the circumstances, where there are already so many anomalies suggesting murder, every one of these is outrageously suspicious. I mean, suppose you had to pick which one of these anomalies was the most outrageous. Tough job. No evasive action. That's a big one, bigly even. No voice reactions by the pilots to their impending deaths. That one gives me the creeps to even think about. No collision warnings. None? Just unthinkable, and not even mentioned by these monsters. The control tower screen showed the Black Hawk at 200 feet. That may be the most important. And of course, Inman and his report have completely evaporated. Most outrageous is a pretty high bar at this point, isn't it? And we're not even close to done.
Last, the FDR does not record GPS information.
Because if we did record GPS, we might be able to use that to give you all kinds of very precise information on aircraft altitude, position, and maneuvers. So, because it would be so critically helpful.
The FDR does not record GPS information. This does not exist in the dataset.
Good grief. You'll say anything, won't you? What a monstrous lie, making it sound as though missing GPS data is routine. In fact, GPS is, of course, the most basic information desired after almost any crash. The first post-accident black box was designed in 1897, and position was the only thing it recorded. The flight data recorder records 400 parameters, but not GPS. Dude, your mama eats kitty litter. So what this this criminal is actually telling us is that, like all this other critical information, the GPS data is also just inexplicably missing from the Black Hawk flight data recorder. Not erased, you understand. These criminals are denying that it ever existed. And we're just supposed to accept all this outrageous news like it's typical, every day. Wholesome and nutritious. You'll take it and you'll like it. Right.
We aren't releasing altitude for the Black Hawk's entire route.
Wait, you're telling us that there was 25 feet clearance between the Black Hawk and the CRJ when they collided. That you're sharing. But you
aren't releasing altitude for the Black Hawk's entire route.
We may have a little trophy for you. Remember, if you will, that the Black Hawk was required, absolutely mandated, to descend below 200 feet starting here. The Black Hawk was mandated to remain below 200 feet for the entire remainder of the flight. There is virtually nowhere along this route where the altitude of the Black Hawk is not a critical issue. But Hella will only tell us the altitude at the end, and then what she tells us is an absolutely impossible lie. My guess is that if we could get the real data, it would show that the Black Hawk was at least at 300 feet for the entire final 3 minutes of the flight. You remember the air collision avoidance system. It calmly alerts pilots when there's traffic in their area so they don't freak out when they happen to see it. And it shouts orders at them when they are headed for a collision, telling them what to do in order to avoid it. Ascend, slow down, turn left, whatever. To do this, the system depends on information sent from the aircraft themselves about what each aircraft is doing, and it is the ATSB system on each aircraft that sends this information out to the ACAS systems on board all the aircraft in the area and to the tower. That's clear, isn't it? The ADSB is the most crucial component of the ACAS collision avoidance system, and the ACAS system is the most important safety system in the sky.
The helicopter was equipped with ADSB out. We don't know why it wasn't transmitting. A lot of people are asking about, was it turned off? There are other things we have to rule out first.
First of all, people weren't asking, was it turned off? 8 days before Hela's press conference, the New York Times said the ADSB system was turned off, and they said it because someone told the Senate Transportation Committee that the ADSB was turned off. The fact that the ADSB on the Black Hawk was turned off is a Godzilla-sized screaming red flag, a giant jaw-dropping anomaly to add to this already huge pile of jaw-dropping anomalies. And effing Hela, as always, tries to play it off like it's nothing.
We don't know why it wasn't transmitting. Was it turned off? There are other things we have to rule out first.
The Black Hawk's ADSB being turned off offers us at least a hint as to why there were no collision warnings. The collision warning system aboard the CRJ didn't get this information from the Black Hawk. The collision warning system in the tower didn't get this information from the Black Hawk because somebody turned off the ADSB signal on the Black Hawk. That's huge. But so why isn't Hela saying any of this? Instead of lying her ass off, looking guilty as hell while trying to survive this absolute shitstorm of insanely incriminating anomalies, Hela isn't saying this because if she did, it would raise questions. For example, it sounds like a complicated question. It's not. Remember that the CRJ got a traffic alert?
1 second later, the crew received an automated traffic advisory stating traffic.
Not a crash warning, just an alert, telling the pilot, you're going to see a helicopter in a second, don't sweat it. But if the ADSB was turned off, how is that possible, right? We have just figured out that there was no crash warning because the Black Hawk ADSB was turned off. But, so, how the hell did the CRJ even get a traffic alert? If the ADSB was turned off, where the hell did the signal come from that set off the traffic alert? See, you start asking questions and eventually, with some help from Todd Inman, you figure out that some mysterious false signal, a counterfeit signal, from some mysterious unauthorized source told the CRJ the absolutely critical lie that the Black Hawk was at a safe 200-foot altitude. And this counterfeit signal set off the traffic alert in the CRJ telling the pilots not to worry, but not a collision warning, telling the pilots to abort the landing and get the hell out of there. The tower also got a traffic warning. Some mysterious unauthorized counterfeit signal from some completely mysterious source told the tower the absolutely critical lie that the Black Hawk was at a safe 200-foot altitude. And this counterfeit signal set off the traffic alert in the tower.
Audible in the ATC radio transmission was a conflict alert in the background.
But not a collision warning. You see what I'm saying? Someone somewhere sent out this false counterfeit signal to the tower and to the CRJ, saying that the Black Hawk was at 200 feet. This false signal showed up on the control tower screens as described by Todd Inman. Because this signal told everyone that the Black Hawk was at a safe 200 feet, the signal silenced any possible collision warnings anywhere. If the CRJ or the tower had received a collision warning, the landing would have been aborted and everyone on board would have been saved. This false safe altitude signal then prevented any collision warnings. It was arguably the principal murder weapon. You see, if the collision avoidance warnings had gone off, the Black Hawk would not have been able to hit the CRJ because the collision warning would have commanded the CRJ to take evasive action. It was almost a perfect crime. The demons had erased all record of this 200-foot altitude murder weapon very successfully. They are telling us that it doesn't appear anywhere in any of the black box flight data recorders. And they almost succeeded in completely erasing the story of this counterfeit signal.
Now we're going to talk a little bit about altitude. And I'm going to preface this, but I want to be very clear. Our team has had some internal debate on releasing one part of this.
People who Todd Inman thought were on his side started telling him, "Don't say it. This is trouble."
You don't realize who you're messing with.
But he wouldn't shut up.
And whenever I explain it, I hope you will understand why.
And I hope by now that you understand, too, and appreciate his bravery. Inman's courageous revelation is the single most compelling, visible, documented evidence of this crime. It is the concrete evidence that this was a sophisticated, complex murder plot.
A couple of words that I like to use, the words common sense. You had a confluence of bad decisions that were made.
There was nothing common nor sensical about any of these events. You remember, way back in the beginning, before you realized that you lived in hell, we asked, why did the Black Hawk not take evasive action? This crash could not possibly have been an accident. The Black Hawk pilots would have seen the CRJ continuously for the last 2.5 minutes from nearly 10 miles away. The night was perfectly clear. With the clearest possible view of their impending doom, the Black Hawk was maneuvered directly into the CRJ. The slightest, tiniest change in speed or altitude would have prevented this crash.
These are not people that should be doing this particular job.
Despite Trump's attempts to vilify them, the pilots didn't do this. You should know that by now. You certainly know that they didn't erase all the altitude data and GPS data. They didn't order Hella to create this shitstorm of lies. And they didn't steer their aircraft into the CRJ. The Black Hawk was commandeered. It was steered into the CRJ by others, not on the aircraft. The military's ability to commandeer the controls of a Black Hawk is not secret or new. This article was published in 2022. We've just seen that the monsters commandeered the ADSB, turning it off, and then replacing it with a counterfeit signal. This allowed them to commandeer the collision warning systems and kill the warnings. They commandeered the black boxes and erased all the altitude data and the GPS data, and substituted a cockpit voice recording for the Black Hawk that, lacking any pilot reaction to their impending doom and lacking the traffic alerts that are heard in the CRJ and tower recordings, simply has to be a forgery. They commandeered the NTSB and forced Hella to pretend not to have noticed the complete failure of the collision avoidance system. They forced her to lie and give obviously false accounts of the altitudes, and to flagrantly tell us all we're not getting any authentic altitude data from her. and to boot Todd Inman, and to suppress his report about the tower scope showing 200 feet.
The people in the helicopter should have seen where they were going.
I've done my best to make the case in favor of the pilots. You have to decide for yourself. I want to emphasize, for the third time, that this video is about honoring the dead by going after their killers. You could do worse in their name. The quotes we've seen from Trump so far came from a press conference that began a mere 15 hours after the crash.
I speak to you this morning in an hour of anguish for our nation. This was a dark and excruciating night in our nation's capital, and a tragedy
gave this
of
long
terrible
speech.
proportions. For the family members back in Wichita, Kansas, here in Washington, D.C., and throughout the United States, we can only begin to imagine the agony that you're all feeling. Our
His
hearts are
condolences
shattered
to the
alongside
family
yours, and
sounded
our prayers
forced
are
and
with you
insincere.
now. And in the days to come, we're here for you to wipe away the tears and to offer you our devotion, our love, and our support. His great support. We do not know what led to this crash, but we have some very strong opinions and ideas, and I think we'll probably state those opinions now.
He was openly bored
Must have
silly
only
as
the
he read
highest
his own
standards for those
long
who work in our
anti-diversity
aviation
speech.
system. Only the highest aptitude, the highest intellect, and psychologically superior people were allowed to qualify for air traffic controllers. And Biden took over. He changed them back to lower than ever before, because this was the lowest level. He's run it right into the ground with his diversity. It matters intellect, talent. They have to be talented, naturally talented geniuses. The FAA's diversity and inclusion hiring plan, which says diversity is integral to achieving FAA's mission of ensuring safe and efficient travel. I don't think so. I think it's just the opposite.
The disaster had just happened. This was supposed to be a memorial to honor the victims and to console the families on the saddest occasion of their lives. How could anyone possibly think that this was the time to be insulting the dead pilots?
You had a pilot problem from the standpoint of the helicopter.
And the distraught controllers.
These are not people that should be doing this particular job. They'd be very good for certain jobs, but not people that should be doing this particular job.
These pilots died while on duty in uniform serving their country. So Trump decides to take this occasion to insult and blame them with no evidence in hand. Good grief, that's not suspicious. And Trump insulted everyone living and dead, first with his obscene hate speech.
The FAA, which is overseen by Secretary Pete Buttigieg, he's a disaster. He's just got a good line of bullshit.
And then by insulting all our intelligences, by demanding before any investigation had even begun that we accept his bitterly racist, sexist judgment that hiring highly competent, proven women and people of color somehow completely but mysteriously caused this crash.
These are not people that should be doing this particular job.
When there was zero evidence, none, to justify such an outrageous accusation in this obviously complicated case.
We're here to offer you our devotion, our love, and our support, his great support. Pete Buttigieg has just got a good line of bullshit. These are not people that should be doing this particular job.
This performance was wildly offensive, barbarously insensitive, rude, and inappropriate to the point of insanity. But does this horror show press conference tie Trump to this horrific mass murder? In a word, yes. In 2 words, hell yes. In 6 words, it shows he was in charge.
Is it possible there was some sort of mechanical failure which made it impossible for them to control the craft?
The CNN analyst recognizes in the crash video what we all see, that this video is deeply perplexing, since the crash appeared to be intentional. And, as any honest person would, he calls for an investigation.
Why the helicopter was above the corridor altitude is the absolute core of this investigation, and that leads investigators to the cockpit voice recorder as much as anything to see what the crew was doing. Was it distracted? Was there some other failure of some kind that took their eye off the what was ahead of them?
The complexity of this case was immediately clear, right? The flight of the Black Hawk deliberately into the CRJ was clearly not an accident by the pilots. The controllers were, no doubt, telling anyone who would listen that their screens showed the helicopter was at 200 feet. But Trump steps out and says, "It's not complicated. The pilots and controllers were idiots."
The helicopter obviously was in the wrong place at the wrong time, but the people in the helicopter should have seen where they were going.
It's common sense.
A couple of words that I like to use, the words common sense.
It's simple.
These are not people that should be doing this particular job.
Nothing to see here. No need for investigation. But both black boxes were still in the water as Trump was speaking. At least half the bodies were still in the water, and several reporters loudly objected to how vastly, obviously, and stupidly inappropriate it was to give such a speech before any investigation had taken place.
I'm trying to figure out how you can come to the conclusion right now that diversity had something to do with this crash.
Because I have common sense, okay?
Common? There wasn't a hint of common decency in blaming the pilots without evidence at their memorial service. And what sense is there to be launching such a vicious attack on the two pilot victims before any investigation? Who does that? Seriously, who does that? If he wants to lead, he should be demanding answers to these obvious, critical questions. Instead, he is palpably leading the cover-up by blaming the victims. Oh, nothing to see here. Wait, nothing to see here. Where have I heard that? Oh yeah, that effing hella liar. Trump is selling the identical line of criminal cover-up. But Trump's lying and misdirection preceded hers by over 2 weeks. But so now we know where she gets it. Trump came walking in with this entourage hours after the murder so that they could celebrate in front of us that in this crime, Trump is their Lord and Master.
The president's leadership has been remarkable during this crisis, dictated by President Trump. And again, I want to thank you for your leadership, Mr. President.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President, for your leadership.
So thank you for your leadership and courage on that, sir.
They are handing him this title of fearless leader at a virtual crime scene where they are all prime suspects, but bowing down to him as their leader. Does he not see that? Let's also observe that from what we've seen so far, at least 2 of the groveling minions that Trump brought to join him on the stage are directly implicated in the killing. Sean Duffy, the Secretary of Transportation, is over the NTSB.
We will not accept excuses.
Hella Liar answers directly to him, and he answers to no one but Trump. Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of War and Plunder, is a very, very, very evil guy. Look it up on Wikipedia. Deus Vult, especially taken together with this tattoo, means I know God's will and God wants me slaughtering people, the more the better. As Secretary of Defense, he was the ultimate commander over the Black Hawk. Everyone with any connection to that helicopter answers ultimately to him, and he answers to no one but Trump. Let's start this point with JD. He's a lot less scary.
There really was a whole of government response. We were all on the phone. We were all communicating yesterday, trying to get to the bottom of this immediately.
Now, JD knows you can't get to the bottom of any complex situation immediately, especially when the evidence was all still at the bottom of the Potomac. Unless you're involved in covering up the murder, you just have to wait for the evidence. And, more to the point, if you're trying to get to the bottom, why do you have to talk to each other? What could Trump possibly tell you that could be of any use? You need to be investigating yourself, talking to the controllers in the tower, for example. What possible reason could you have to be talking to each other? Oh, I see. Getting your story straight. You had to get advice about lying from the expert.
And I want to echo your leadership. From the moment we found out about this, we were in contact with the White House trying to determine exactly what happened.
I mean, what do you expect from a minion? So Hegseth says he was in contact with the White House, and they were telling him
exactly what happened.
How does that work? As defense secretary, he was in charge of the helicopter. Shouldn't he have been contacting the commanding officers of the pilots, asking about their mental health? And talking to the helicopter mechanics, asking if there were mechanical issues? Mobilizing the military rescue and salvage crews? He should be discovering the details, and then he should be reporting to the White House.
Exactly what happened.
It seems that Pete wants us to know that the entire event was orchestrated from the White House. The question we're trying to get to the bottom of is, who was in charge of the murder? And Pete's answer is loud, clear, and enthusiastic: the White House. The White House literally dictated to these minions exactly what they would say had happened.
When we deal with safety, we can only accept the best and the brightest, the reforms that have been dictated by President Trump. And again, I want to thank you.
When you don't have the best standards in who you're hiring, you're not getting the best people in air traffic control.
A mistake was made. The president is right. We will have the best and brightest in every position possible, whether it's in our air traffic control, whether it's flying Blackhawks and flying airplanes. The era of DEI is gone.
Given what we now know, could these monsters possibly look any more guilty, screaming these racist lies, smoking guns in hand, blaming the victims? That's what this amounts to, isn't it? The Black Hawk pilots were murdered by these guys who are blaming them.
The era of DEI is gone.
Okay, these clowns are deeply involved in this murder, but I want to emphasize that they are cowardly and stupid clowns. They didn't get away with this. We caught them because of their cowardice and stupidity. We saw earlier that they didn't invent the technology for commandeering a Blackhawk. That's old news. And I've learned that every ACAS installation kit comes with a device for testing the system that can send out a false ASDB signal to test whether the newly installed ACAS system is receiving it. And, unless special precautions are taken, this false signal will also be received by any nearby tower and by any aircraft in the area. The killers didn't have to invent this technology either. It's also old news. There was nothing clever about this crime. Any idiot with access to the military could easily have done it. And this group of idiots did do it. The moral of the story is, don't be afraid of them. Fight them. Right? Obviously, they chose to commandeer this Blackhawk because it had a female pilot. But why, out of the thousands of civilian flights, did they choose this one? I say it was not random. They chose this flight because they want to kill diversity. So they chose to kill one of diversity's most powerful advocates, Kia Duggins. Kia was a Harvard Law School grad. She had been president of the Harvard Legal Aid Bureau. She was a civil rights leader, an intern to Michelle Obama, and a Howard Law School professor, a future compelling candidate for president. For people like these racist haters, she had a target on her back 10 miles wide. So I especially want to celebrate her. I believe Kia Duggins was targeted because she stood for something. You should do her homage by also standing for something. Trump wants to be a dictator. He boasted to his generals that he admired Hitler. He threatens the courts, usurps the Congress, threatens to cancel elections, and to run for an illegal third term. Dictators need to be feared as both evil and fearless. So on June 2nd, Trump issued this new, scary official portrait. 4 months before, he committed this horrific, high-profile crime in this blatant fashion to put fear into us all, but especially to put deadly fear into any Republican in Congress who might oppose anything he dictates. Trump rivaled Ted Cruz, for example. Cruz called bullshit on this story, that ADSB being turned off was somehow excusable.
This was a training mission, so there was no compelling national security reason for ADSB to be turned off.
He knows Trump murdered these people. Right now, as I'm saying this, Trump is trying to hand his billionaire, trillionaire friends $4 trillion in tax cuts.
This vote was very controversial, even among Republicans who didn't like how it increased the debt by $4 trillion.
In fact, reputable Republicans say it will increase the debt by $9 trillion.
Some Republicans were resisting this bill, so to get it passed, Donald Trump needed to use all of his political powers of persuasion.
Trump made the rare journey to the Hill to meeting with House Republicans behind closed doors for 90 minutes for what he says was just a pep talk.
He called out members by name. He threw the F-bomb around.
Politics used to be deals and handshakes and pass my bill and I'll do something for you. Now Trump is just like, pass my bill or I'll kill you.
Such murderous threats are much more credible if the person making them is a known mass murderer. Let's take a step back for a moment, to plant our feet and to consider carefully just who we're dealing with here. Trump has a loyalty and devotion to Israel that defies any explanation. He has handed Israel all of Palestine, Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, the West Bank, and now Gaza. Concessions every previous president has resisted. With Trump's avid encouragement and interference, Netanyahu is stealing all of Palestine while murdering upwards of 60,000 civilians in cold blood. Trump even appears to be leading Israel's genocide. So murdering 67 people in a plane crash is rather small potatoes compared to over 60,000 murdered in Gaza in the last year, and all the other continuing atrocities. These guys already were mass murderers. They would not have flinched at the notion of committing another 67 more. So when tomorrow Trump tells you that Iran attacked the United States, so now we have to slaughter 20 million people, don't you believe it. When he tells you that he's the big bad wolf and you better run and hide, don't you believe it. Stand up. Be defiant. You're part of a huge, diverse, global tidal wave. I'm taking the Gulf of Mexico, and Greenland, and Panama, and Canada. I'm the king of the world.